So welcome in, Steve. Looking forward to today's discussion, and go ahead when you're ready.
Righto, thanks a lot, Conrad, and thanks to all who are joining us today. I do want to express my appreciation for you guys tuning in, and it was great last week to be able to meet Lauren and Derek and Jennifer Nelson and a couple others. That was Dave Brandt's field day, just to interact and so forth. And I tell you, that certainly, if without going into all the details, the enthusiasm for cover crops and for soil health is still quite huge. And I could, I guess, say that it was kind of like singing to the choir, maybe, but the choir is so big that they had to turn people away from that field day. It was over 300 people, I believe, were there. So, again, good to meet some of you. That's always just fantastic to do. So anyway, today we're going to talk about cover crops and slugs. And it wouldn't surprise me if guys like Andy, who's up there in southern Alberta, I'm guessing here, but I imagine you don't have slugs. You know, if you want to, you can type that in, or we could talk later. But for the rest of us, farther south, slugs can be a challenge, and it's kind of synonymous with cover crops and or no-till, because we're setting up an environment that slugs are able to thrive in. Now, that being said, I am going to discuss some of my journey in dealing with slugs. I certainly have plenty of them around here in my area, actually on my farm, and I would say that I do have noticeable slug damage. When I say noticeable, I'm not talking about replant type noticeable, but we have noticeable slug damage pretty much every year, unless we have a drier than normal spring. So anyway, I see Andy indeed does not have any slugs. So that's one thing, Andy, you don't have to worry about. The rest of us, it's something we need to manage around. I'm here to say that I do believe there are a number of small details in management that we can be able to manage our slugs. Notice I didn't say control them. The best control for slugs is something that I don't encourage, and that would be tillage. So I think we're pretty much all in agreement. We don't want to go back to moldboard plowing just to control our slugs. So I'm approaching it from the standpoint, for me personally, I'm no-tilling and I'm using cover crops. That's what I do, and that's what a lot of you do here on this, that are on here today. So that's the approach we're coming. How can we manage slugs in the context of growing our crops? So I see Lauren says he's already seen them here. I haven't looked for them yet, Lauren. I don't even want to, but I'm sure they're going to be waking up because we have nice warm temperatures here this week. So let's get right into it here. In the past, for me, there was basically two methods of control, and I was just thinking, my mindset was, I got to control these slugs. So I think as I evolve in my own way of thinking about cover crops and soil health and biology, I no longer immediately think of killing something in the context of using a chemical or something like that. I try to back up and say, what is the biological function here? What do we need to be thinking about? So in the past, the Deadline MP stands for mini pellets. I think that's what it stands for. Deadline is a product that I guess you could say the good thing about it is it pretty much only affects the mollusks, which is the terminology of the family that the slugs are in. Slugs are not an insect. As I understand, there's certainly a lot different. I have not heard of dramatic negative effects by what is in the active ingredient in Deadline. I have heard some people say there is. I have heard that they were going to be taken off the market. I don't know what's up. I think they're still available. But that has been kind of in the back pocket of everybody for many, many years. And I'm going to show you that I still have some in my storage shed just in case. But I'm going to talk about that through here. The other way is maybe kind of a home remedy type way. Take some management, but 10 gallons of liquid nitrogen. I don't think it really matters if it's 28% or 32%, but with 10 gallons of water, the 20 gallon then per acre is enough to pretty much cover everything, but you have to actually hit the slug itself. So the slugs have to be out. And that means usually in the evening or at night. And sometimes it can get a little difficult to actually maybe spray at that time, depending on what type of equipment you have. So, anyway, that's some of the stuff. I've used both the Deadline and this here with liquid nitrogen. I've used that successfully years ago. I'm talking 15, 20 years ago. The thing about nitrogen is, if you want to look at a good side of that, if we're going into corn, we can actually account for some of that nitrogen for the corn plant to utilize it. So again, we're only going to kill the ones that are actively feeding at that moment and that are actually hit, I should say, with the chemical. I think the salt in it or whatever, it just burns them up because they're obviously there's very soft skin and very sensitive to that. So I have done that. I found out that if it's not a sunny day, if the next day is cloudy, you won't get much burning on the corn. And we're talking in the V2 to V4 stage here. You won't get many singed leaves. If you have a sunny day after you do it, you may get more burn. But it is an option out there. So that is kind of what I've done in the past. This next picture is actually my neighbor's soybean field this past spring. This is a little less than a year ago, and that's classic slug damage right there, where you can see that that kind of various shaped. It's always kind of centered in a center point, and then it kind of comes out from there. So when it's at this stage, you definitely probably have lost some yield and total. There's some spots in there that you've lost total. This guy went in and had to replant those areas. I actually replanted I planted soybeans for a neighbor, did some custom planting, and he called me up last spring, about 2 weeks later, and he said, I think something's the matter with the soybeans. Did you have your planter set right? And I said, I was confident I did, but I just went over there in the four-wheeler and I saw right away it was slug damage. He ended up planting about 2 acres. He ended up planting 3 times. So that was a pretty bad infestation. I will say last year here it was cool and wet, which is kind of the perfect storm for slugs. The plants, the seedlings grow slow, and the slugs have plenty of time to feed on them. Because a quick growing plant in warm weather can a lot of times outgrow slug damage. So I want you to remember this picture here, because I'm going to talk about using cover crops and maybe how cover crops can help reduce slug damage. And it's primarily in the concept of planting green, which we have talked about before, where we're going in and planting our cash crops into either living or very recently killed cover crop that actually keeps the slugs in the cover crop longer so our cash crop can grow. And so you see this picture here. I also did research last year on slugs and on my farm, and I'm doing some again this year. It's the 3rd year on a Penn State study. I'm going to share about that coming up here. But I want to back up with that now to my journey, I'll call it. When I was in France in 2008, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had slug issues. If you know anything about France, at least in the northern part, the Brittany area, and the northwestern part, it would be, they don't have hot summers, and they don't have cold winters, because France is essentially on two sides surrounded by the ocean and the south by the Mediterranean Sea. So it's more of a temperate climate, which makes it for a little slow in the spring for their cash crops to grow, which makes slugs even a bigger problem. And one of the things they were doing at the time is, you see at the picture on the left, this is a monosim planter, and they actually had these slug bait attachments that, as you can see there, the tubes went down, and then when you look at the right-hand pictures, a close-up of the closing wheels where they just dribbled out these deadline mini pellets that I referenced previously. So they're just putting basically a trail right over the row, and they were saying that's the most cost-effective way they could do it. They didn't feel there was a need to control them full scale, just when the slug lumbers over or crawls over toward the row that they're going to have, they want some slug bait there. So that's where I kind of thought that was interesting. But what I want to share next is what really made my attention, really got my attention. And this is a picture of my good friend Frederic Thomas from France, clearly an expert in cover crops and reduced no-tillage. And they were telling me, and he was saying they're seeing some results by planting mixed species cover crops, by planting green, looking at cover crop rotations. But the thing that most intrigued me was that he said we're thinking the wrong way. We need to try to enhance the predators of the slugs. And probably most of you have heard this before, but the most famous predator of a slug is a carabid beetle. And that's just something that I realized intrigued me, and I realized it's something where I need to be more aware of this. So it's a systems approach. We're not just going to do like one treatment. I mean, historically, us farmers have been kind of trained to think, if we have a pest, let's get the sledgehammer out, so to speak, and kill it. And in the meantime, we may be doing other secondary effects that make the whole situation even worse sometimes. So this whole thing of a systems approach is what really attracted me to try to look at my farm how I can not eliminate. I don't think that's too much of an ideal, I believe. I'm not saying it can never happen. Right now, it's all about managing the slugs. So let's come back to Pennsylvania now, where I'm from. And there's been several Pennsylvania farmers who have noticed that they seem to have less slug damage when they planted green. And in this case here, I'm planting green there on the kind of the left-hand side of that picture. On the right side, you see the cover crop has been terminated a little earlier. So farmers were coming and saying, we're seeing less slug damage. So Penn State said, okay, let's test it out, see if it's, to see if the anecdotal evidence is indeed scientific or not. So this picture here is of last year, 2016, where we did the second year of a study that about 4 or 5 different sites across Pennsylvania are terminating cover crops at 2 different stages, early and late. And early and late is kind of defined each year. Last year, because of the wet weather we had, it was 3 to 4 week difference because it was wet. The year before, in 2015, it was only some places 5 days different, and other places short as 2 weeks different. So, early and late is very subjective, but what we're trying to look at here, not just slugs, but is planting green, is that a viable option? And by doing replications, as you can see here, we put it out to a good test. So the other thing they did is look at predators of slugs, just to see what's going on. Can we better understand maybe why we are seeing less slug damage where it's planted green? Dr. John Tooker from Penn State University did some research in lab where he put different types of cover crops and put slugs in there, and he did notice, and this was interesting, that the slugs seemed to prefer some of the cover crops to the cash crops when he planted like a soybean in there or or a corn plant. So that by having a green cover crop, in other words, food for a slug, is maybe a tactic we can use, because if you can imagine, you look at the right-hand side of that picture, that's kind of past prime for slug food. You know, slugs are they're not into dead stuff as much, and they're into green living plants. So instead of killing everything off brown, having our nice little corn or soybean seedling coming up, and all of a sudden it's like ice cream for dinner, you know, for the slugs. So a lot of theory here that does make sense, but does it really work in reality? So a couple slides here with some data. Some of this is 2015 data, some of this is 2016 data, but we did indeed find more predators. Now this is more than just the carabid beetle or ground beetles. There's different names. Actually, we found out that lightning bugs, the larvae of a lightning bug actually, or the insect part, actually eats slugs. So we have lightning bugs in our area here, so they're definitely helping our slugs. But we indeed saw some more predators there, which is kind of supporting our theory. Next slide here is 5 locations. The brown bars is what was killed early. The green bars is planted green. Now, I want to mention here that the planting date is the same day, but it's the termination date that determines the early and late here. The planting date's at the same day. Now, this is soybeans, and you can see it's consistent across there. If you see the Myers farm there, it was almost the same, where we actually had less slug damage. This is observed damage on the plants where we planted green. So this is great, and it's what we expect and so forth. But let's look at the corn. Little different story here with the corn. And of all things, you see my plot over there on the far left. I had more than double the amount of slug damage. Now I'm talking slug damage. This is just looking at a certain amount of plants and everything. I had more than double the slug damage that was compared to where I had terminated early. And as you look across there, all the ones except the one at Rock Springs, which is actually at Penn State, kind of agreed to that. So I wanted to just show you the best and the worst. Now, I didn't put up the 2015 data here. I didn't want to get through so many slides. What I'll just summarize, and by the way, we're the second year into this. They just flagged the plots yesterday for me for this year. The real short take-home summary of the second year of this 3-year project is overall slightly less slug damage in corn when we average 2015 in. In soybeans, both years have been significantly less slug damage in soybeans. Now, I think those of us who have done a lot of planting green and so forth, planting soybeans into particularly a cereal rye is always fairly easy to do. It just seems like it works so many times. So there could be some other variables going into all this. I don't think that's just slugs. But right now, we're seeing significant less slugs in soybeans, and very slightly, it's almost a tie, almost no difference with corn in the amount of slugs. And again, I didn't put up all the data here, but the yields on corn is about the same. The yields in soybeans are higher in planting green, and that falls in line with a lot of other studies and a lot of experience that people have had with that. So I'm not going to dwell on that a whole lot more because I want to stick to the topic of slugs here in this. But this is some really, I think, helpful things going on. We just met the other day, those of us who are cooperating, met with Penn State, and we're just had some discussions, and it's going to be interesting to see what year 3 does here and how that goes out. So just summarizing what I just said there, that slightly less damage, especially in soybeans, and also slightly more predators. So that's kind of what we've been theorizing, and it looks like we can back it up now as we move forward. So I'll just say that the right-hand side there is a ground beetle or a carabid beetle. There's different versions of them. I'm not sure exactly which is the exact one that I have. I've looked at them, seen them running around. But there's another issue that we need to bring into our discussion here that's kind of gathering some momentum. And that's the whole thing of using the seed treatments that we typically use, probably on 99.9% of seed corn has some sort of neonicotinoid seed treatment on it. And there's different names for them. Poncho is one, Gaucho is an older one, I think. But these neonics, I'll just say it, neonicotinoid, neonics for short, we think there's a potential issue here that could be exacerbating our slug problem, because, and it's called a non-target secondary kill. So these beetles, like we see on the right, like to eat slugs. So the beetles are our friends. They eat slugs. If a slug eats a young corn seedling or a young soybean seedling, it will ingest the neonic in its system, but it has zero effect on it because it doesn't affect mollusks or slugs. Then the carabid beetle comes along and he has a free lunch by, or he sees this slug. He eats the slug and the neonicotinoid is in the slug and it kills our friendly carabid beetle or ground beetles. So it's kind of like, you know, we're fighting a war, but we're losing battles. And there's, I know this is something with, again, I mentioned John Tooker again from Penn State. A lot of what he does is studying this now. And so is this something that we need to kind of step back a little bit and look at it? I think it is. And I will just say that I am not saying we need to not use any insecticides or anything like that, but I am saying I think we need to relook at this. In the context now, as we move into more of a biological-based system, I feel this kind of thinking here, this kind of consideration has merit. So I tell you what, we've been planting now as part of our project untreated seed, seed that has no treatment on it. And I've got to tell you, after a lifetime of dumping in pink, green, or blue seed, when you dump in yellow seed into the corn planter, it is weird. It's just like, this doesn't seem right. But I've done this for 2 years now, and this is part of our study. And we are not finding, and I haven't done all the comparisons, but in what I'm going to call, and I'll just say maybe an advanced biological system, a system that has good soil health, been using cover crops for a while, probably have more predators in the area and so forth, that there may be something to this. Do we need the insecticide we have been putting on? I'm just still asking the question, although I'm getting a little more confident now, and next year, after this year, if things still look good, I don't plan to use any seed treatments on my seed. I'm not saying that everyone should do that. I'm just saying where I'm at, and I am looking at this pretty hard because I think there's something there. So I'm just going to kind of maybe leave that at that. Probably now would be a good time to break, because I'm sure this might have stirred up some questions. So if there's anyone, would have a question, if you can unmute yourself and ask it, I'd be happy to have a little discussion on this. So
sure.
While you're thinking,
Steve,
I see Dan.
Yep, go ahead there with Dan's question. How would you quantify what is a mature biological system?
Well, to borrow a phrase from Dan Tallery, it depends. I think I'll just, in all seriousness, you're 5 years into this. You got experience. You you have been using cover crops. You learn how to use them. You're maximizing life in the soil. Your soil health is improving. I have no data to support all this. I'm just going on some anecdotal evidence by other farmers from what I see on my farm, and it kind of makes sense to me. So I certainly would hate to see any farmer go out there and just try to get, it's actually tough to get seed that's not treated, but even if you do not try this on your whole farm. So that's kind of my answer to that.
I brought back everybody's mic, so if there's any other questions, we'll take a few questions here before we wrap up today's talk. Any other questions?
Anyone have any questions? Okay. I see John's mic's open. I don't know, John, if you're available to talk or not, but if you are, go ahead and ask. Okay, I think we're going to move on. I do have a few more, I guess, say little things to add here. Picture you're seeing there, it's titled Proper Row Closure. And this is one area that I think is an easy fix. There's plenty of option of closing wheels out there in the market today. Any type, if we're planting into with a living cover crop, you're going to pretty much have to have some sort of spoked or spiked closing wheel to get that seed slot closed. I've seen slugs literally crawl down the row and just start nibbling on the little shoots. That is devastating there. You're going to kill the plant. A slug can do some quite visible damage sometimes to a V2, V3 corn plant, but it's amazing how corn can rebound out of that. Having that row closed is one simple thing that anyone can do to at least help eliminate some of the problems. I wanted to show you my slug bait. About 4 or 5 years ago, maybe, I had heard that this was going to be outlawed, and still 4 or 5 years ago, I certainly wanted to have some on hand, so I bought several hundred pounds just to have. But if you can see there, it's quite dusty. And I just wanted to mention that I have not used any slug bait, or I've not had to control slugs in any fashion for the past 5 years. That does not mean I do not have slugs, because I certainly do. I actually just yesterday, in one of the fields we're going to do our planting green in, it appears to me like I had some slug damage last fall in the triticale cover crop. So by all means, I want to be clear. It's not about eliminating them, but through the use of various things, I'm going to summarize here a couple more things. I'm just saying that I have not had to use slug bait. Does that mean it may not happen this year? Well, I don't know, but last year was one of the most severe years for slugs. And even though I had relatively high numbers back there in that Penn State study, I didn't even consider controlling them there. It was just that was the way the numbers worked out, and the plants were far enough along that it really didn't hurt them much. So I just wanted to mention here that I still have some on hand. I'm not going to give this away to anybody, but they haven't been used. So just going over a few other things here, I'm going to add to what we talked about, and then if you have any questions brewing at the end there, we can discuss them here all together. But I think planting green is indeed helpful, I'll say, in in reducing slug problems. Cover crop mixes, and the whole thing here is this is strategically to help build up our natural predator base that can keep the slugs in check. That's why I think cover crop mixes, and I could just say cover crops as well, but cover crop mixes I think enhance that. I've heard people say, you know, plant a little earlier and beat the slugs. Plant a little later when the cash crops grow quicker. I don't know. That may work some years. I'm just kind of, I don't think I ever managed my slugs with that, but just say it. Some people have said if they know they have bad slugs, aggressive use of row cleaners. I don't like to use my row cleaners very much at all, but I've heard of people say they really clean the row off, and that helps. Here's one that's probably one of the more effective ones, increased diversity of cash crops. I understand limitations, but if it's possible, if you're having a bad problem, that leads into my next point of include winter small grains. There again, when we're coming out of winter, we can see that they just don't have problems in the spring when small grains like this time of the year are coming back to life. And I mentioned too proper closing of the seed trench. And just one more list here that I have. Here's another question mark here, but pollinator plots. I'm now growing pollinator plots around my woods. I figure the outside 20 to 30 feet, I'm losing money on it anyway. Why not plant pollinator plots, flowering plants that can encourage my beneficials? It's one of those things. I don't know if it's economic or not, but what sold me on it was the idea I'm losing money next to the woods anyway. Why not plant something there that could maybe help my beneficials? Then we always have slug bait, kind of expensive depending how you apply it. You can get down to maybe $10 an acre, a little less strategically putting it on the row, or $20, $30 an acre depending how you broadcast it. One other one here that I've heard someone say they thought was they were putting iron on liquid iron, like foliar iron, to build up the iron of whatever the vegetable crop, and they noticed that it seemed to discourage the slugs. I don't know if there's anything to it. They said they're going to try it this year. I just listed that as something I heard. Using starter fertilizer, in other words, encouraging that plant to give it its best shot, its most vigor, to try to outgrow slugs. I think there's a little merit to that. Then at the beginning I discussed about spraying a 50-50 mix of liquid nitrogen with the final mix there of 20 gallons per acre when the slugs are feeding. I still think that's an option. It's a little inconvenient. Maybe if it's in corn, you can get the benefit out of the nitrogen there. And then this last one here, avoid nicotinoid insecticides. I think there's something there to that. That's certainly, I'm comfortable now not using them. Give me a couple more years to maybe wean myself totally, but that's at least where I'm at personally. So that wraps up my discussion, and as you're thinking about questions, if you want to open up the lines again, Conrad, I see there's a few questions here I can answer, but I just wanted to say that next week I am planning on talking about rolling and crimping cover crops, because it's kind of the time of the year we think about doing that. And so with that, I can just answer some questions I have that are here. And then, actually, Conrad, why don't you probably summarize them a little bit better than I can here right off the computer. So,
yeah, I mean, one thing that I think would be helpful to touch on is, what do you do if you have a significant infestation of slugs, and you haven't planted green or you haven't boosted your beneficial insects? I mean, if you're in the middle of a crisis, are there any options other than bait to look to?
Well, I would say the emergency options would be slug bait and this nitrogen application. That was what I would call the emergency options. And I don't know, I see Dave asked that question. Good to have you on today, Dave, by the way. So I feel that the nitrogen thing is indeed valid. I've done it, and I've seen a reduction. But you have to do it when the slugs are physically on the leaves and it will be touched by the spray or by that solution. I mean, I know the small scale, the garden way is to bury a can in the soil level and fill it up halfway with beer. beer seems to attract slugs, they'll crawl right into it. But that's that's the home gardener remedy.
Mm-hmm. Steve, have you noticed, while we're waiting for anybody else to jump in here, have you noticed any correlation between the species of cover crops that you plant and the presence of slugs? Do certain cover crops attract slugs?
Well, it depends which year you ask that question, and I'm saying that not to be facetious, but this was part of our discussion we had with the researchers at Penn State. And I think it was in 2015, they seemed to notice that when corn was planted into crimson clover, that the corn was better than some of the other single species of cover crop, meaning that the slugs appeared to prefer crimson clover a little bit more than the corn. In 2016, they did not see the effect. So you're scratching our heads now. So we're hoping that 2017 will tip the scales on some of this. I don't think we can say which ones yet. I don't think. I think that's, I know something that is definitely on the radar to look at specific species. I will say that what I shared here at the very beginning was that Dr. John Tooker from Penn State, in an aquarium in a controlled situation, slugs did prefer cereal rye. I think it was cereal rye, or I'm not sure if it was cereal rye or annual ryegrass over corn. So there was a preference there. I do know of a neighbor here who he planted 15-inch annual ryegrass with a 15-inch planter, a precision planter, and every other row was annual ryegrass, and the alternative rows was radishes. Next spring he came in, he planted the corn in the radish rows, and then he had this green strip of annual ryegrass, and he sprayed it right after he planted. So he terminated the ryegrass. And he said even until the ryegrass was brown, he noticed that the slugs stayed in the annual ryegrass. Maybe they were happy enough there they didn't bother go looking for the corn that was literally only 15 inches away. I don't know. That's just anecdotal evidence, but it seems like there's a trend toward that. So. I like Jerry Hall's comment there. It seems like a waste of beer. So. Anyone else want to just speak up and have any questions?
Yeah, Steve, it's Wayne here. Any idea on slugs with mixes versus single species?
That's another, yeah, great question, because we just had this conversation last week at Penn State, and you know, Dr. John Tooker is a part of this, and he just doesn't see clear trends. He said he doesn't see much difference in that. What I wish we could do, and this is, maybe this could occur at some point because there's only so many things you can test. It would be, because I think it's kind of like no-till. You know, when no-till was just started, you know, a lot of the research was done on first-year no-till, and they just kept, you know, doing their research on that. And now we're not testing the system. We all agree no-till is a system. Cover crops are a system. Now we're paring it down to a small subtopic of slugs and cover crops. So you almost ideally need to look at the system, and that's multiple years. So what would happen if I would plant a mix for, let's say, 5 years, and then I plant single species for 5 years, and maybe no cover crop for 5 years? Let's say there's 3 variables in a plot, and you would just keep it like that. That, to me, would be good research with you know, a tangible result. So far, I don't know of anybody who is doing that, but to me, that would be really good data, and would be really fascinating to see. I also see Dan asked the question about annual ryegrass being an advantage of a slower kill, particularly with glyphosate, which is what we typically use for annual ryegrass. I think there is something to it. I would say, you know, if you're choosing between glyphosate and gramoxone, if that's your two choices, I think you're better off using the glyphosate simply because of that slower kill. So no proof. That's just kind of theory and so forth. That's what I would think.
Okay.
Steve.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, back before we were planting green, I know some of the work out of Ohio State that if you could get the corn planted early enough so that it was, you know, pretty good size, that it just the size of the corn was too big for the slugs when they really start feeding.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree. I think there's something to that. I believe indeed that is the case, Dan. For some situations, that's also a kind of a plug also for starter fertilizer. Starter fertilizer does indeed get the corn out of the ground greener and faster. The question is, does it end up to be a yield benefit or not? At least in some areas. I know it does, but not every area. So that might be a reason to use starter fertilizer, just to beat the slugs. I think there's something to it. I really do. That's going to depend on each individual farm. I haven't used that tactic directly for slugs of desiring to plant early. That being said, I'm a relatively small grower, and I don't have to get out early just to get my acres covered though either. But I've not used that tactic to go early.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for their participation today, and hopefully you have some new tools to explore some of these new management techniques to solve this problem that is relevant in some areas and, as we heard from Andy, not in others. So thank you, Steve, for those tips and insight. After the webinar here, if you guys want to head over to the Facebook page, we can continue the discussion there, or maybe you can snap a picture of one of your carabid beetles feasting on a slug and share that with the group. But that'll be the end of today's webinar. Come back next week. We will be talking about rolling and crimping cover crops, which is a very timely topic and one that Steve will have a good bit of insight on. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a great day. Bye now.